sort of encourage you and inspire you to ask the right questions. So we need to start learning to ask the right question. So since we know accounting is one of the business sciences group, and accounting is all about evaluation of businesses, थोड़ा सा हमने जो अगले lectures में भी देखा था. The first thing that you need to see is what happens right at the birth of a business enterprise. What happens right in the beginning, जब enterprise or business enterprise exists नहीं करती, and you are in the process of thinking कि why do you need to have a business? So the first question, that very basic question that you need to ask yourself is, what is the purpose of the existence of an enterprise? What do you really want to achieve out of a business enterprise? So this is a very basic thought. What you need to do is refine that thought process in order to be able to think clearly. So this is the first question. What do we want to achieve if we want to start with the business enterprise? Or if I put it more in more refined terms, you could say that the first question is actually demanding you to define the objective of this very business enterprise that you want to start. So what do you say? What should be our objective of starting a business enterprise? You can write your answer in the chat box, or you can unmute your mic and directly talk to me. I hope all of us can hear me clearly and can also see the screen. I'm sorry, मैंने पूछा नहीं. ईमान, आपको आवाज़ आ रही है? मिनाल, और आपको स्क्रीन भी नज़र आ रही है? Okay, Minal, thank you. Iman, you too, right? Great. Okay, so the first thing, if this is the first, basically this has to be the most foundational question that you have to ask yourself. Okay, what do I really want to achieve from this business enterprise? So that means you need to define the objective. So Minal's answer on the chat, profit. Most of the cases, obviously, the objective of starting with the business enterprise would be profit. We agree, Iman? And Alina, obviously, we agree with that. Alina has already taken this lecture before, so she's just here to revise the previous concepts. Understood, Iman? You can always give me a green check on the participant windows if you understand it, or you can give me a red cross there so that I can go back and revise everything. Okay, great. So that particular objective, once you have defined that your objective of starting with an enterprise is that you want to make profit, then obviously that is going to lead to the next question that you need to ask yourself. And the next question should be that how are you going to achieve your objective, right? If your objective has been defined and you now clearly know that it is profit, let's say, the next thing is that how are you going to achieve your profit, obviously. Or if we want to refine this particular thought, we need to identify, this particular question is actually demanding you to identify a sustainable economic operation which will help you achieve your objective of profit. For example, if your objective is profit here, right? A sustainable economic operation means the nature of the business that particular enterprise wants to engage in. जैसे हमने अपने initial जब हमने पहली बार ये lecture लिया था, तो I gave the example of LGS, that if LGS as an enterprise need to exist, then it needs to identify itself a sustainable economic operation, which is going to be educational services. Let's say the objective. Let's say you're a lawyer, right? So you want to define your objective as profit, and then you want to identify a sustainable economic operation that would be providing legal services to your clients. That would be answer to the next question. Or if your objective is profit and you want to start with a restaurant, then you need to identify a sustainable economic operation as giving food or entertainment services to your customers. So, do we understand this part so far? Please give me a green check mark or a red mark on the participant window, or right. Great. Good. Take it. Let me just clear it all. Good. So this is going to lead us to our next question. So our objective is clear. We know what operation do we want to conduct. The next question is, what do you need to start these operations? You have identified that you want to be a law firm, or you want to be a school, or you want to be a restaurant. The next question is, what do you need in order to be that particular organization? So if we refine this thought into a more clearer thought, it should mean that resources that need to be acquired. What resources do we need in order to be able to start educational services operation in a school, or start food delivery business in like a restaurant, or start giving legal services to your clients in a law firm, right? So what resources which are needed to be acquired? This is the next question in line, right? So after that, that means if you want to be, say, if you want to provide, let's say, educational services, so that means you need to have a school, and that means you need to have a piece of land जिसके ऊपर आप buildings construct करेंगे, और फिर उसके ऊपर आप उसको furnish करेंगे classes के साथ, furniture खरीदेंगे, आपको lab equipment चाहिए, आपको computer lab चाहिए, there are so many things, motor vehicles चाहिए ताकि जो भी आपकी transportation needs है उसको fulfill किया जाए. So all of these resources that you need, like land and buildings and furniture and equipment and everything, all of these resources is what you need in order to be able to sustain an economic operation. In this case, it's providing educational services, which will help you achieve your objective, which is in this case profit, right? So that's how everything is connected. So far so good. Give me a green check mark or red cross. If you need to ask any question, you can always write it in the chat box, or unmute your mic and ask me. Okay? Good. So now comes the final question, and the biggest question of all. So in order to achieve the objective of profit, you need to have a sustainable economic operation, which is in this case, let's say, educational services. For that educational services operation, you need to have an infrastructure of resources like school buildings and furniture and vehicles and everything. And in order to acquire these resources, you need a sponsor. You need to know, the next question in line is obviously, we need to know how are we going to raise money for the resources that we need, which can sustain an economic operation, which will help us achieve the objective. So that is how everything is connected, right? So basically, the biggest question of all, sponsors of this enterprise. Who are going to fund this enterprise? Who is going to provide money to this enterprise, right? So who do you think is going to provide money for this particular enterprise? You can write anything in the chat box, whatever first thought you come across. Give me an answer. What do you think? Who's going to fund this enterprise? पैसे आने चाहिए ना आपके पास. अगर आपके पास पैसे नहीं होंगे तो फिर आप resources कैसे acquire करेंगे? The owner and the third parties, right? You understand? The owner of the enterprise is going to provide you with the primary sponsor. तो हमेशा owner of the business enterprise होता है ना. उसके बाद फिर आप किसी third party को पास जा सकते हैं, आप banks से loan borrow कर सकते हैं, या किसी individual से borrow कर सकते हैं. ठीक है. Okay, now I'm going to ask one tricky question. Alina is going to hold on to her answer because Alina has already known about this because she's doing it for a revision session. Okay, my audience, primary audience is Iman and Vinal. Okay. अगर आप as an individual अपने आप को इस category में, इस workflow में place करना चाहते हैं. So now let's get rid of the basic thoughts and now let's put the final conclusion that we have here. So we need to know our objective, that is profit. That objective will tell us कि हमें क्या business operations engage करने चाहिए ताकि हम वो profit achieve कर सकें, जैसे इस case में educational services हैं. Then that question will tell us what resources we require in order to sustain this economic operation, and then whatever resources we identify that we need will further lead to this final question, that how much money do we need to raise from our sponsors, in this case, as Alina has just mentioned in the text box, that the primary sponsor is going to be the owner and secondary sponsor is going to be someone else. कोई बैंक हो सकता है, कोई individual हो सकता है जिससे आप पैसे borrow कर सकते हैं. आप कौन है? जब मैं आप की बात कर रहा हूँ, like who you truly are in this particular, in this mind map that you see on your screen. If I ask you that you need to put yourself somewhere in this mind map, which particular box or boxes will you choose to put yourself in? You are an individual and you're thinking about all of these questions, and all these questions have led you to this final block of sponsors. If you want to place yourself in these blocks, where would you place yourself? Who are you in this particular flowchart? Obviously, objective to कोई individual नहीं है, ना ही sustainable operation है. So these are the two boxes that you're looking for. That where do you exist in this flowchart? It's okay, make a mistake. Doesn't matter. Don't be afraid of making mistakes. Iman Farooq says sponsor, right? Excellent, Iman. Minal, what do you say? You find yourself in this. Iman says, I find myself in this final block. Minal says, I find myself in the number 3 spot here, which is the resources to be acquired, right? And finally, Alina, what do you think? Where would you put yourself in this flowchart? It's okay. Give me a wrong answer. Doesn't matter. I actually welcome wrong answers, so that means I will be able to know कि मुझे कहाँ से दोबारा where do I have to pick it up from in the previous lecture. Great. The business entity so far. So all first 3. Right. Alina, very clever. You've done that. Okay. Anyway, so this was a trick question actually. I wanted you to make that mistake here. The mistake is that you will choose one of the 4 boxes to put yourself in. In fact, you are all the 4 boxes here. You, when you consider yourself, accounting के अंदर जो सबसे पहली चीज़ हम पढ़ाते हैं, वो perspective definition होती है. So in order to have a perspective, you need to know who you truly are and where you stand in order to, where you will choose yourself to put in what particular spot you want to put yourself in order to view or in order to have that world view around you. Take it. So it's okay. This was a trick question. You were supposed to make a mistake here. The question over here, most of the cases when I ask this question, my students, they choose the sponsors block here, because obviously अगर आप एक business enterprise शुरू करना चाहते हैं तो obviously it's your idea, it's your thought process, and you want to own it. So most of the cases, individuals put themselves into the shoes of sponsors here when they look at the business enterprise. So that will take it to a next slide. You, in accounting, you are not going to see things from sponsors' perspective. You will not put yourself in this block here. This is who you are, the entirety of things. You're not existing in one block here. You exist in all the 4 blocks. Let me explain what it means, right? Let me move on to the next slide, where my basic principle explain करता हूँ, उसके बाद मैं फिर वापस आऊँगा इसके ऊपर. The entity principle. Accounting is based on certain fundamental principles and concepts, just like any other subject, right? Physics जो है वो Newton's के laws of motion के ऊपर based है, chemistry जो है laws of thermodynamics के ऊपर based होती है. There are so accounting is based on certain fundamental principles. There are roughly 12, 13 principles that we are going to discuss over the course of our syllabus. So the entity principle is one of the most basic of all. Let me just show you these points one by one, then I'm going to explain the meaning of these points, and then I'm going to connect it what we did in the first slide, the previous slide. So the first point is that the first thing that people generally make a mistake is that they confuse business and owner as one entity. You're not supposed to take business and owner as the same thing. The first emphasis here for the entity principle is that the business and the owner are to be considered as 2 separate entities with distinct identities from each other. So business or sponsors या owners को आप आपस में confuse नहीं करेंगे. You can see Alina's answer in in the text box. Okay, the business entity is first three. Basically, what Alina wanted to do over here is to separate the idea of the business and the existence of the business from sponsors, because that is very important. This distinction is extremely important, that we do not confuse the business entity with the sponsors. Sponsors alag entities हैं, business एक alag entity है. So the first thing that we need to believe is that business is considered a theoretical person or an artificial person for analysis purposes. The business entity itself should be treated like a person, like owner. Owner is a person. Exactly the same, we need to consider business entity as a person, like a living, breathing person living in the physical world out there. Although business as a person does not exist, but we will create a theoretical person or an artificial person in our imagination for a very important reason. I will tell you the next part. So business itself is not a person, but we will treat it for all practical purposes like a living, breathing person, just like the owner. Why do we need to do this? This is the key idea behind it. All accounting analyses are conducted from business's standpoint and never from the owner's perspective. Everything, when you are trying to evaluate, accounting primarily is evaluation of business. आपने जो भी business start किया है, आप देखना चाहते हैं कि वो business कैसा perform कर रहा है. So accounting analysis is all about evaluation of the business. So in order to evaluate business correctly, you need to see things from the business's standpoint. And in order to have the business's point of view or business's standpoint, you need to sort of create an artificial or theoretical person in the form of a business entity. Why is this so important? That why do we need to create business entities? So that basically the answer is simple, that we needed to create an artificial entity or an artificial person just for this purpose, ताकि उसका अपना एक point of view हो. A point of view क्यों important होता है? Point of view, अगर आपका point of view change हो जाता है तो आपका चीज़ों के बारे में opinions भी change हो जाती हैं, आपकी final conclusion, उनका analysis भी change हो जाता है. जैसे in the original class when it happened, I gave the analogy of Kashmiri struggle, right? Kashmiris are struggling to achieve their independence from Indian government, right? So I asked the question to my audience in our first class. Obviously, Alina will not answer Abhi. Alina will hold her answer for her friends Iman and Minal. Okay. So Iman and Minal, if I ask you that Kashmiri movement, आपके ख्याल में एक freedom fighters movement है या कि एक terrorist movement है? So what should your answer be? Right, Iman and Minal? Do you think that the Kashmiri struggle, is it a freedom fighters movement or a terrorist movement? Write your answer in the chat box or just unmute your mic and say it. Do you consider Kashmiri movement as a freedom fighters movement or a terrorist movement? आपको अच्छा Iman says freedom fighter, obviously, right? What about Minal? Minal, you think Kashmiris are freedom fighters or terrorists? Minal को आवाज़ आ रही है मेरी? Okay, Minal को आ रही है आवाज़. Maybe there's a lag then. Yes, obviously, right? And now I'm going to ask the same question to Alina as well. Alina, what do you think? Is this freedom fighters movement or a terrorist movement? Right? Great, freedom fighter for me. You understand what you need, and it depends on the perspective. Perspective of whom? Are you seeing it from the Pakistani citizen's perspective or an Indian citizen's perspective? If you ask the same question to an Indian citizen will definitely call the Kashmiri movement as a terrorist movement, just like we call Taliban movement as terrorist movement. You ask anyone on the other side of Afghani border, any pro-Taliban person, कि Taliban movement एक freedom fighters movement है या एक terrorist movement है? Obviously, they will say that they are fighting freedom, they are fighting Americans on their soil and blah blah blah. ठीक है, but if you ask a Pakistani, they say no, Taliban are terrorists. They are doing what they are doing is they're detonating bombs on Pakistani soil. They are killing people, innocent people. They are demolishing girls' schools and so on and so forth. So everyone have their own opinion. And how do they form their opinions? They have a certain perspective. They have a certain point of view. If the point of view changes, the conclusion or the opinion that you eventually form is also going to change. And it's not going to just change. It becomes exactly opposite. Right? एक पाकिस्तानी के पर्सपेक्टिव से कश्मीरी एक फ्रीडम फाइटर्स मूवमेंट है, लेकिन जैसे ही आपका पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू दूसरी साइड पे चला जाएगा, आप यही क्वेश्चन आप एक इंडियन सिटीजन से पूछेंगे तो वो कहेंगे नहीं, कश्मीरी स्ट्रगल इज नॉट अ स्ट्रगल, इट्स अ टेररिस्ट एक्टिविटी. Same happens with us on Pakistani soil. If we ask people who have been affected by all this terrorism, we ask them कि okay fine, ये जो terrorists हैं, ये जो bombs फाड़ रहे हैं, ये freedom fighters हैं या terrorists हैं? आप उनसे कहेंगे, वो कहेंगे obviously terrorists हैं. लेकिन अगर आप उन terrorists के point of view से देखेंगे तो वो कहेंगे नहीं, हम तो एक अमेरिका से आज़ादी की एक struggle कर रहे हैं and so on and so forth. So the point of view is the key. If you have that point of view defined right away, only then you will be able to pinpoint कि आपका analysis और आपका conclusion है क्या. अगर आपका point of view stable नहीं है, static नहीं है, constant नहीं है, standardized नहीं है, तो फिर आपका conclusion भी कभी standardized या constant नहीं होगा, वो हमेशा confused conclusion रहेगा. Right? Now, what does it have to do with accounting? All of this discussion. अच्छा, so far we understand the perspective and conclusion, उनका आपस में connection. Do you understand कि perspective dictate करते हैं कि end conclusion आप क्या draw करने वाले हैं? Right, Minal? Good. Iman? Good. Alina already understands that. Alina? Right? Now, what does it got to do anything with accounting? What does it have to do with accounting? Accounting is all about analysis, and a very specific analysis, and that analysis is all about the business progress, and that business's progress all depends on the evaluation of transactions in which business engages in its everyday life. So when you have to evaluate transactions, okay, so let's say, I'll give you an example over here, person X pays $100 to person Y. Right? Now this is an example of a financial transaction. X pays $100 cash to Y. Right? Do you think this particular transaction, is it a cash payment or cash receipt? Do you think we need to evaluate this transaction, we need to analyze this transaction, we need to draw a conclusion that how are we going to treat this particular transaction? This is one very basic example in accounting. हमने अगर इस transaction को accounting में treat करना, तो obviously we need to classify this transaction. So we have two questions to ask to ourselves. Should we treat this transaction as a cash receipt or a cash inflow, or should we treat it as a cash payment or a cash outflow? So what do you think? Put your answer in the chat box. Is this a cash inflow or cash outflow? Alina is going to hold her answer. Obviously, Alina knows the answer, the true answer. But first, Iman and Minal will give me your answer, please. Right, cash payment, Minal Iqbal. Excellent, Minal. Very good, very good. Iman, what do you say? Iman Farooq. Sorry, Minal Iqbal. Achha, Iman Farooq has said, okay, sorry, I missed the So Iman has also said it's a cash payment. We understand that Alina, I forgot Alina. Alina, please, can you put your answer now? It's both. And it's confusing, it's both. Because if it is both, then obviously I am confused. I don't know about you, but I am confused. How can it be both? Right? Alina, can you describe your answer in a bit more detail here? How is it both? If it's a long answer, you can just unmute yourself. Okay, great. Yes, of course, Alina, you're most welcome to unmute yourself. I prefer that you use your mics. And then after giving me your answer, you can unmute yourself. You can mute yourself then, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, of course, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, so from X's perspective, it will be a cash payment because money is flowing from X to Y.
Excellent.
And so person X is paying the money to Y.
Excellent.
However, from Y's perspective, it will be a cash receipt because Y will be receiving the cash from X. And so depending on the perspective, our conclusion will change as to the answer.
Excellent answer, Alina. Very detailed and very, very to the point. Iman and Minal, we understand. We have just discussed this part. It's the perspective that eventually will define the conclusion. So when your answer was cash payment, आप क्या कर रहे थे? आप सिर्फ और सिर्फ उसको X के point of view से देख रहे हैं transaction को. If you see this particular transaction from X's point of view, X is losing cash to Y, and that is why your conclusion was that it was a payment. But if you see the same transaction from Y's point of view, as Alina has just mentioned, then Y is actually receiving cash from X. So from Y's perspective, it's going to be a receipt of cash. So that means it's both, right? It's both a receipt and a payment. It only becomes clear if you choose a specific point of view. So if you keep X's point of view in mind, then obviously it's a payment of cash. Then you have a definitive conclusion. Okay, fine. That is a payment of cash because you have chosen X's perspective over here. Sorry. But if you decide in favor of Y's perspective, then from Y's perspective, this is a receipt of cash. And that is why it is impossible for you to come to a definitive conclusion unless you decide that which point of view you're going to choose. And that is the importance of this third point here. All accounting analyses are conducted from business's standpoint and never from the owner's. There is a reason for that. In order to have a uniform analysis, you need to choose either X or Y. You can't have both, right? You need to choose one entity's perspective in order to come to the conclusion. So that is why business accounting is all about evaluation of your business. So naturally, you will have to choose the business entity's point of view to identify every transaction and to see everything from business's standpoint and never from the owner. Why not from the owner? Because owner may be involved. The sponsors of the business may be involved in their own personal transactions which have nothing to do with the business entity. So obviously, if you choose owner's point of view and not the business's point of view, you will end up analyzing so many other transactions which are completely irrelevant to the business entity's evaluation. And that is why we need to emphasize on this point even more, that all accounting analyses are going to be uniform only if conducted from one standpoint and not two, right? So which standpoint would it be? It will always be the business's point of view and never from the owner. Why? Because we are evaluating our business. So हमेशा business entity को evaluation होनी है, तो हम सिर्फ business entity से related transactions को analyze करना चाहते हैं. So if we want to analyze only business relevant transaction, we have to choose the business standpoint. Owners may be involved in other transactions which have nothing to do with business. So naturally, we can't really keep owner's perspective in this regard. So we understand the third point here. It's very important that you understand the third point with clarity, because this is going to play a very big role later on. So please give me a green check on participants window if you understand this part so far. Minal, thank you. Alina already understands it. Okay, now comes the last point of the business entity principle, that the owner's personal transactions, they fall outside the scope of accounting analysis. We have already chosen the business's standpoint here, right? We have already chosen business standpoint, so that will further conclude that whatever happens in owner's personal life, that has nothing to do with accounting analysis. That is owner's personal concern. He or she can deal with that in their own personal capacity. Being a professional accountant, your concern is only the business enterprise and nothing else. And that is why you will always analyze transactions, you will always derive conclusions on those transactions using just one standpoint or one perspective, and that is the business's perspective. So hopefully that's clear. So we move on to the next slide. So this is who you are, right? This is who you always are going to be for the rest of your accounting lives. You will always put yourself in this particular person's shoes. You are the business entity and you're never the owner, right? This is what the conclusion is from our previous slides. And this business entity needs to exist to fulfill a certain purpose. And we have already seen from the previous slides that the purpose is a sustainable and a profitable economic operation. This is the purpose for this particular person, for you to exist. You need to exist only because you want to fulfill this purpose here. Okay? And a profitable economic operation, in this case, legal services providing to your client as a law firm, or educational services providing to the students as a school, that is the profitable economic operation we are referring to over here. This operation cannot exist without certain resources, without land, buildings, furniture, vehicles, lab equipment, science lab equipment, air conditioning equipment, projection equipment, if you take an example from the school, right? So all of these resources are needed in order for a sustainable and a profitable economic operation. Without this, it's not possible. And in the last class, I remember, I gave the analogy of the fish and the aquarium. If you want to keep a pet fish, you like keeping fish, then this is your fish, right? But that fish cannot survive or exist without an aquarium. You need to have an aquarium in place in order for your fish to survive, right? So that aquarium is provided by the infrastructure of these resources that we have just considered: land, building, furniture, fixtures, vehicles, equipment, etc. All of these resources, they represent the aquarium over here, and the sustainable economic operation like educational services or legal services, that is your fish here. In accounting, we have a special name for these resources, or the aquarium, जो हम symbolize जिसको हम aquarium से कर रहे हैं. All these resources have a special name in accounting. We call them the assets. So these assets are required in order to have a sustainable economic operation. Without the infrastructure of these resources or assets, the fish cannot survive. Without the aquarium provided by these assets, the fish called a sustainable or a profitable economic operation, it cannot survive. Now, these resources, we know from the first slide, these resources need to be bought. So, in order to buy these assets, land, building, furniture, fixtures, vehicles, etc., all of these assets, they need to be bought. So, for that, we need money. So, the money has to come from somewhere. And if you see the chat box there earlier on, we've decided that this money is going to come from owners and third parties. The primary sponsor of this the entire activity is going to be your owner. You need to keep your owner separate from you. And who are you? You're the business entity here, right? So you need to keep your owner separate from you. So if you need these assets, who are you going to refer to? Comes the owner in the picture, literally speaking, right? So the owner is going to provide you with all the money that you need in order to acquire or buy these assets, and these assets will enable you to sustain a profitable or an economic operation, right? In accounting, the money that comes in to you from your owner, we have a special name for that, and that is what we call the capital. Capital is the term that describes whatever owner contributes towards your assets. You are the business entity, these are your assets. You could not have bought these assets without the help of owner's contribution. So whatever help the owner is providing you in the form of money or financial resources, that is what we call capital. So the owner provides you capital, and you utilize the amount you receive in the form of capital and you convert them into assets. This is what this arrow means. Do we understand this part of the story so far? This is not a complete story yet, but so far, this part of the story you understand? Give me a green check mark. Great, excellent, excellent. Then, what if the owner cannot provide you with everything that you need? In that case, you will refer to other investors. Third-party financiers over here, they generally mean people who are willing to invest in you, not as owners, but simply as a loan provider. It could be a bank, it could be an individual, right? So these third-party financiers over here, they will provide you with the remaining amounts that you need in order to fulfill your requirement of these assets. And these amounts that you receive from your third-party financiers, in accounting, we also have a special name for these funds that you receive from external investors. We call them liabilities. Liabilities generally mean what you owe. If you are liable to pay someone something, that means that person has become your liability. So this is one person, this is you, the business entity, this is one individual or person, this is another separate individual called the owner, and these are also other separate individuals called the third-party financiers. So you need to keep them separate. All of them have their own individual identities. ओनर के बारे में और थर्ड पार्टी फाइनेंसियर्स के बारे में तो इस क्वेश्चन को एब्जॉर्ब करने में कोई मसला नहीं है. द ओनली थिंग दैट वी नीड टू लर्न इज दैट द बिजनेस एंटिटी इटसेल्फ also is a person. So that is what the business entity principle means. Treat this entity as a person. So funds, they flow in from the two sources. You use those funds to acquire the infrastructure of assets that you need, and now the business has a physical existence. So इससे पहले business जो था वो सिर्फ एक conceptual existence थी उसकी. It never really existed. It was just an idea, nothing more than an idea. But after this part, now the business has a proper structure. You can identify a business's physical existence in the real world by looking at its premises, by the offices, and all the assets it owns. So now the business has come into existence, into physical existence. Now it's going to be easier for you to treat it like a person. And now business's assets are there in place, and business is now in a condition to start its economic operation. So अगर आप एक school हैं तो operations will begin, students will be admitted, teachers will be hired, students आपको fee pay करेंगे, आप अपने teachers को उनकी salaries pay करेंगे, अपने business के बाकी के expenses pay करेंगे, and that is how you will make your profits or surpluses, right? So what will happen once the ball gets rolling? So you, the business entity here, are going to make certain surpluses. Those surpluses have a certain way of distributing them. The next question that I'm going to ask you is, before I reveal the rest of this presentation, what is this person's incentive? These people over here, third-party financiers over here, they have provided you with loans. You have borrowed money from them. Why did they provide you the money to be able to enable you to buy your assets? What is their incentive in you? Why did they provide you these loans? You're the business entity over here. Yep. Anyone? What incentive do third-party financiers or external investors have in you? Why did they provide you with these funds? Iman Farouk, excellent. Interest. Minal, you agree with Iman's answer? Alina does, right? Right? Yes, excellent. Take care, Alina. Yes? So obviously, when you engage yourselves, engage your assets into the profitable economic operations, you will end up making certain surpluses, and those surpluses have a certain claims against it. The first claim is these third-party financiers who have provided you with these funds, they want something in return from you, and that is what you will give them, the interest on their loans. So we understand this part here. Whatever surpluses you make, you will have to pay back interest to the third-party financiers. Yes or no? Agree? You give me a green check mark on the participants window. If you agree, good. Iman, Minal, how about you? Alina, thank you. Minal, good. And then after paying the interest from the surpluses, there will be a certain part of the surplus left. We call that profit. So what happens to the profit? This is what happens to the profit, right? The business owes this profit to its owner. The owner has provided you capital just like the third-party financiers have given you these funds. The owner has also provided you these funds. Only then you were able to acquire all these assets. So owner has a certain incentive in you. So what is the owner's incentive in you? The owner's incentive is that whatever profit that you make out of your economic operations here, you are going to give all the profit back to your owner. That is the purpose of your existence. So you, the business entity, is like a machine. So this machine, there is a certain input and then there is a certain output, right? So you are going to process the funds provided by you, provided to you by these entities, and you are going to process these funds and you will convert them into surpluses and profits, and you are going to pay back your sponsors. The third party sponsors, you will pay them back in the form of interest, and the first party sponsor, your owner, you will pay whatever profit you're left with, you'll pay all those profits back to your owner. So this is how everything is connected so far. So if you understand this, please give me a green check mark on the participants window, please. Excellent. Minal? Good. Very good. Excellent. Now, now keep this conclusion in mind over here. This is the game here, the real game. Capital, liabilities converted into assets. Now this connection of capital, liabilities and assets. Capital is what the owner provides you. Liabilities are the third party investor who provide you the money. And then you convert this money into your own assets. This connection is the most fundamental conclusion in our accounting subject. The entire building of accounting is based on this particular connection, assets, liabilities, and capital. And we call this conclusion as the accounting equation, which is the title of this chapter. Jo bhi aap book kharidenge, in most of the cases it will start with this particular chapter. The accounting equation is basically that whatever assets you possess, they only exist because someone contributed towards them. And who are that someone? Who are those someones? The owner who has provided you with the primary finances, we call that capital. And anyone else who's not the owner but is also willing to invest in you, we call them liabilities in general, right? So assets ka sum is always going to be equal to the sum of the contributors' contributions coming from these financiers, your sponsors. We understand? So this is what we call accounting equation, and now we're going to define these terms properly. So what are assets? Assets by definition are the resources which the business entity requires in order to achieve its economic objective, which is making profit or surpluses for the stakeholders. Stakeholders कौन है यहाँ पे? दो obvious stakeholders यहीं पे आपको नजर आ रहे हैं, आपका owner और वो लोग जो owner नहीं है लेकिन उन्होंने आप में contributions आपको दिए हुए हैं कुछ, right? So two stakeholders are over here. There are some other stakeholders too. We will discuss all the stakeholders in a business entity later on. Abhi, I just want to keep it simple, right? So these are your assets, those resources, the aquarium in which the fish will survive, right? So these assets are just simply that aquarium. What are the common examples of the assets? The most basic and the most important of all the assets is what we call cash. So items and cash equivalents का मतलब होता है those items which can be convert it into cash on a given and short notice. That's how we define cash and cash equivalents, right? Anything that can be converted into cash on a given and short notice, which is usually 24 hours. अगर विद इन 24 आवर्स आप किसी चीज़ को बगैर किसी सिग्निफिकेंट लॉस के कैश में कन्वर्ट कर सकते हैं, दैट इज़ एन इक्विवेलेंट ऑफ कैश, दैट इज़ एज गुड एज कैश. The example of a cash equivalent for now that you need to understand is just one, and that is your bank account balance. आपके पास या कैश आपकी पॉकेट में होता है या सरप्लस कैश आप अपने बैंक अकाउंट में सेफ कीपिंग के लिए रख देते हैं, राइट? सो बैंक इज एज गुड एज कैश. Why? Because you can utilize your bank account balance just like you can utilize your cash. जहाँ पे आपको कैश स्पेंड करने की ज़रूरत होती है, आपके पास कैश नहीं होता, आप अपना ATM पे जाके कैश withdraw कर सकते हैं, or you can have your debit card directly swiped at the retailer wherever you're shopping. So that is as good as cash. So cash, why is it so important? Because cash asset होगा तो फिर बाकी के asset they will come into existence, because you will need to buy assets using your existing cash. So cash and cash equivalents is the most important and the most basic of all the assets that you have. Then you can have other examples like land and buildings and plant and machinery and furniture, fixtures, etc. All of these are your. I'm sorry, आज का lesson थोड़ा सा लंबा हो जाएगा because I want to sum up the first two lessons in this particular one. So just hang in there with me. I hope you don't have any commitment. Okay? I just need another 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes at the most. Yeah. So these are different examples of your assets, as you can see on your screen. So how do we define capital? The fundings provided by the owner to the business. You're the business entity always, right? The fundings provided by the owner to you in order for you to acquire your assets. Let me rephrase this statement to make it a little simple, right? So the funds that you receive from your owner in order for you to be able to acquire your assets, these funds that you literally borrow from your owner to acquire or buy your assets, these are that's what we call capital. And capital is a financial obligation for the business entity, and that obligation is towards its owner or owners. ज़रूरी नहीं कि एक ही owner हो, there could be multiple owners, right? The point over here to understand is that capital is what you owe to your owner. An obligation is a commitment. When you commit to something, then that means you owe your commitment to someone. So capital is a financial obligation. In order to simplify the statement, I would say that capital is what you owe to your owner. Okay, you are the business entity. The owner has provided you with certain funds. So whatever funds the owner has provided you, you owe it back to your owner. And how do you repay the owner for this contribution? You give the owner back the profits. Whatever profits that you make, you're going to give it back to your owner. That's how the arrangement works between you and your owner. Okay, so that's your capital. And liabilities are other contributors, other financial obligations of the business entity towards the third parties for goods or services acquired. So if you have goods, services, or cash borrowed from anyone else other than the owner, that person is not your owner, but that person has contributed towards your assets just like the owner, that person will be categorized as a liability. Examples are trade payables or creditors. Creditors are the people the business owes because आपने कोई goods या कोई चीज़ें खरीदी होती है और आपने उनके लिए पैसे भी pay नहीं किए होते, and you promise to pay them in future. So trade payable or creditor means the same thing, right? If you have borrowed a loan from the bank or from an individual, that person or the bank is also an example of a liability. Any other short-term borrowings and bank overdraft. Bank overdraft is, I will explain bank overdraft maybe later because I'm running out of time. It's going to चलो मैं कर ही देता हूँ. Bank overdraft is basically when your bank account goes into a negative balance. आपके पास बैंक में अगर $100 हैं, then $100 अगर आपने spend करना तो you can maximum spend $100, right? Because if you try to spend more than $100, your bank account will show a zero balance or an empty bank account here. But sometimes bank banks, they give their loyal clients and their long-time clients the facility of overdraft. Overdraft means that if I have that kind of a relationship with my bank, and the bank is willing to give me an overdraft facility, that means if I had $100 in my bank account, I can even spend more than $100. I can spend $110. I can buy something for $110, and the बैंक $100 तो मेरे अकाउंट से डिडक्ट हो जाएंगे और $10 बैंक अपनी तरफ से कंट्रीब्यूट कर देगा उसकी तरफ, and now my bank account goes into -10 balance. That means now $10 is what I owe back to my bank. So my bank account is normally my asset. It falls here in cash and cash equivalents. But if my bank account goes into negative region, it becomes a bank overdraft, and then bank will become a liability because now you owe to your bank. So we understand the bank overdraft here. Please give me a green check in the participants window. Great. So this is the general structure of the accounting equation, and our all procedures, whatever accounting procedures we are going to develop, are all going to be based on this fundamental conclusion. And there is a simpler way to understand this accounting equation, and that simpler way is that accounting equation simply tells you what? That what we own, what the business entity owns, that is what you call the asset, and what you owe is what you put on the right-hand side of this equation. What you owe is broadly categorized into what you owe to your owner, that is what you call capital, and what you owe to third-party financiers, we call them liabilities. So what we owe is always going to be equal to what we own, right? And what we own is the assets. All of this, cash and cash equivalents, land and building, plant and machinery, all of this is what we own. And at the expense of owning all of these assets, we owe the same amount to someone. Part of this is what we owe to our owner, and the remaining part to someone else who doesn't happen to be the owner. The last item on the assets is what we call receivable. Receivable is someone who owes us. In fact, the next slide actually describes what do we mean by receivables. So our assets, the left-hand side of the accounting equation, we generally categorize it into two types of assets based on their structural nature. So your assets are either classified as property type assets, or they can be classified as receivables type asset. A property type asset is an asset in your own possession. If you have your asset in your own legal possession, we call it a property type asset. And a receivable is your asset being held by someone else, and you're only waiting on its collection. So that means it's only a matter of time when your asset will come back to you, but right now it is held by someone else temporarily, right? So a receivable is an asset which is yet to be received, right? That's what we call. So if your cash is lying in your own pocket, that is a property type asset. And if your cash is lying in your friend's pocket, that will become a receivable. Your friend will become a receivable to you. So the bottom line is that your asset belongs to you, right? Your asset belongs to you whether you have it in your own possession or someone else holds it for you and owes it to you. So basically, when you owe to someone, that's a payable or a creditor or a liability. That's a liability. When you owe someone, that's a liability. When someone owes you, that is an asset. Okay? So they are opposites of each other, right? So when you owe to someone, you call it a creditor, right? Let me just see if which one was that? This one, right? So when you owe to someone, sorry, just a sec. So when you owe to someone, then it's your creditor. Wait, take it. So that's your creditor, this one. When you owe to someone, you call it a creditor, and that's a liability. And when someone else owes you, you call it a receivable, and that someone else becomes an asset, right? So that's the difference between what we own and what we owe. So someone who owes us our money is what we own, like an asset. And someone we owe money to, that is a creditor or a liability in general, right? Just a second. Let me clean up this part. Done. So the last thing for today's lecture is this last slide. So left hand side of the equation, हमने देख ली assets. They can be classified into either property type assets or receivable type assets. The right hand side is either liabilities or capital. So liabilities and capital, they both have one point of similarity, and that point of similarity is that they both represent your financial obligations towards someone. You owe someone. You're the business entity, right? So they both have this point of similarity, right? But there is a certain very important difference between these two obligations as well. So the first one is what we call, we define what liabilities are. Liabilities are the financial obligations towards third parties. The important bit here is these are set to be repaid by a defined deadline. Every time we talk about the liability by definition means something that you owe someone, number one, and number two, whatever you owe to that person, that needs to be repaid by a clear-cut, defined date. There is a date that you have to repay that person whatever you have borrowed from that person, right? So liability technically is a repayable obligation, something that needs to be repaid by a defined deadline. And जब तक आप वो liabilities pay off नहीं कर देते, जब तक आप उनके funds borrow करके अपने पास use कर रहे हैं और आपने उनको pay back नहीं किया, you are also subject to another liability, another obligation on top of the main principal amount that you have borrowed. On top of that, you have another obligation, and that obligation is interest. The business entity pays a fixed amount of interest as a reward to these financiers until these liabilities are paid off, right? So, number one, liabilities are repayable amounts to be repaid by a definitive date. There is a clear-cut defined deadline that you have to pay back those amounts. And until that deadline doesn't come and you haven't paid those amounts back, you will periodically pay them interest, right? We understand this part? Give me a green check mark, please, quickly. If you understand the structure of liabilities generally. Now, capital, coming to capital, capital is also an obligation for you. You're the business entity. You also owe to your owner, not just the external financiers. You also owe to your owner, right? So, capital, however, is a very specific type of obligation. Capital is a permanent obligation. That means capital will never be repaid. Unlike loan from a bank, अगर आप किसी बैंक से एक लोन बोरो करेंगे तो आपको as a business entity वो लोन एक certain date पे वापस pay करना है. But capital is not something that you are going to pay back to your owner, and there is no deadline. There is no defined time frame for the repayment of capital. Capital is what you have borrowed for an indefinitely long period of time. There is no deadline that you will pay back your owner, whatever the owner has provided you. So capital, in contrast, is a permanent obligation for the business entity with no defined time frame for repayments. In fact, business will never pay back its owner, the capital owner has contributed, as long as the business exists. If we have to put this conclusion into more accounting terminology, you can read this point number 4. For the business entity, as long as it's a going concern, the capital remains a non-repayable obligation. A going concern is a business which in the foreseeable future doesn't see itself liquidating or dissolving. If you are a business entity who happens to be a going concern, that means as far as you can see in the foreseeable future, you are not seeing yourself as a dissolved business or a liquidated business. That means you will continue your operations, legal manner में or smooth manner के अंदर, you will continue to your operations in the foreseeable future as long as you can see in the future. You're not dissolving, because only a dissolving business can repay the capital to its owner. A going concern or a continuing going concern is simply a fancy term for a continuing business. एक business जो continue कर रहा है future में, वो dissolve नहीं होगा. So that means that business requires a permanent financer or a permanent sponsor, and in that case the business is not going to liquidate. So if you are a going concern, then you will need the capital permanently, and if that is the case, then capital will never be repaid to the owner, because if you repay the capital to your owner, you will cease to exist. Now, allow me to prove it mathematically. So, from the previous slide, we know that assets are equal to capital plus liabilities, right? This factor, liability over here, this needs to be repaid. At some point in time, these liabilities are going to be paid down and they will become zero, right? So at some point in time, when you pay off all your liabilities, your accounting equation will be reduced to this, right? Assets equals capital plus zero liabilities or no liabilities at all, right? So in this case, what will happen? Your assets are going to be exactly the same as your capital. So if I ask you that you're the business entity over here, if you want to repay your capital, if this factor, capital factor, needs to be brought down to a zero, if capital goes zero, then the assets have to be zero at the same time. We understand this connection? The capital, if reduced down to zero, that means you repaid your owner. That means there won't be any assets in existence anymore, and you will no longer exist. We understand this connection? Please give me yes or no. Great. Green check mark for yes. Iman, good. Alina already does. Right. So that means we cannot exist without the owner's contribution. We are the business entity, and that is why point number 4, the owner for the business, as long as it's a going concern, as long as it's a continuing operation, as long as it can see itself not liquidating in future, the capital remains a non-repayable obligation, because if you repay your capital to your owner, you will cease to exist and you will no longer remain a going concern. That's what it means. We understand point number 4, please? Give me a green check mark. Or red cross. Red will do as well. Right. Okay. Good. Thank you. Now, finally, whatever profits which are generated by the economic operations of the business entity are owed to its owner as a reward for providing capital indefinitely. We have already seen this arrangement in the previous slides. That owner has provided you the capital, and now we know that that capital contribution is provided to you indefinitely. That means the owner will never demand capital from you ever, as long as you exist as a business entity, as long as you are a going concern. Owner will never demand the capital back from you. So the owner is providing you capital indefinitely, right? And in order to provide this permanent source of finance to you, the only thing that the owner expects from you is that the business entity owes all of its profits back to its owner. So that leads to the next conclusion, that profit that you will make, you're the business entity and you will eventually make profits. All the profits, therefore, are also an obligation. They are also an obligation, a financial obligation of yours towards your owner, right? So profit, therefore, is also an obligation for the business towards its owner, just like capital. So if you agree with all the 6 points, please give me the final check mark in the participants window, because then this lesson will be over. Excellent. Minal, do you have a question, Bide? You did not put a check mark here, so no. Okay, Minal understands everything. देयर इज स्टिल स्मॉल पार्ट. इसके बाद हमने एक्चुअली सेकंड लेसन में हमने कुछ एक्सरसाइजेज की थी जिसमें हमने वो मैंने एक वर्कशीट शेयर की थी आपके साथ ऑन गूगल क्लासरूम. See if you can attempt the first couple of questions. I think we did up to 6 questions, right? If you can attempt those 6 questions, and if you understand those questions on the Google Classroom, there is a worksheet that I left there. Actually, we did that worksheet in the second class. So if you can do that on your own, leave a message on the WhatsApp group that you understood that part, 1.1 to 1.6. But if you have trouble solving those questions, then tell me. I will come online tomorrow for 40 minutes or 30 minutes and I will help you solve those questions. Because unfortunately, आज बहुत लंबा lesson हो गया. I'm sorry. But we need to do that. So you will try 1.1 to 1.6, the worksheet that I have posted on Google Classroom. If you can understand those questions, fine. If you can't, then tell me on WhatsApp. We will have a small half an hour lesson tomorrow, right? And then all of you will be together with the class. बाकी की सारी class के साथ आप मिल जाएंगे. उसके बाद जो भी हम काम करेंगे, you'll have a perfect understanding. You will not be at any disadvantage compared to the rest of the class. Understood? Got it? Any questions? Okay. Okay, great. Okay, then we will meet again. अगर आपको प्रॉब्लम होगा तो कल, अदरवाइज मंडे को हमारी क्लास है 10:20 पे, नॉर्मल रेगुलर क्लास. ठीक. Do try those worksheets and tell me on WhatsApp that you understood or you did not understand. Okay. I'll see you on Monday then, 10:20. Stay back if you have a question, or now you can leave. If you want to leave, you can leave now. But if you have a question, then stay back.